Welcome back and welcome to the Policy Roundtable, Climate Neutrality and the New Energy Order, with a question mark which is carbon pricing up to the twin challenge? It's a pleasure to conclude this long week with such a hopefully interesting Policy Roundtable, which concludes also our project, the LIFE DCET project, where DCET stands for Deepening International Cooperation on Emissions Trading. It has been a 3-year project which tried to align the different emission trading system, the main emission trading system, and so the active participation of the regulators of the European ETS, of California, Quebec, China, New Zealand, and Switzerland. And first of all, I would like really to thank the regulators. Here we have Ruben and all the others who participated, because they're really insightful discussions all over these 3 years. When we decided the name of the project, we played with words a bit. So we found an acronym which we liked, which we spelled in Latin. DCET in Latin means will tell. So life DCET, if you mix up English and Latin, means life will tell. And actually, life told us many unexpected things through these years. When we started the project, the world was totally different, I have to say. It was before COVID, before the Ukrainian war, before also, if you want, the acceleration that the European institutions have given to the climate policy. And over the last few years, we have seen the European Green Deal, the Fit for 55, Repower EU, the birth of the ETS2 for building and road transport, the Social Climate Fund, the CBAM, just to mention a few quite relevant aspects that are really changing the scenarios, the landscape of the European and the international policy. So this Policy Roundtable was born from the desire to see whether, as the question says, the carbon price will be up to the twin challenges of decarbonization and, say, just transition. But if you want decarbonization and internationally just transition, so keeping the world together, we said twin challenges, but we might have written multiple challenges, because there are really multiple challenges to address. And so, as a conclusion of such a project, we thought, let's look into the future. So what's next? What are the next challenges? And for this reason, we would like to discuss today the scope and objectives of the ETS reform, the functioning and implications of the CBAM, and also the integration of carbon markets at the international level, which is at the core of the project we conducted over these 3 years. And to discuss about this, we have a bunch of people who know what they are talking about. Let me introduce them in two groups, let's say. The first part will be on carbon pricing in the EU climate policy, and we will have Ruben Vermeeren from DG Climate, the European Commission, Daniele Villoresi from the Ministry of Ecological Transition, and Valeria Costantini, who will stay with us a little bit more, from, obviously, University of Rome 3. Before giving you the floor, and in the second part, just to anticipate, we will discuss about the international perspective on carbon pricing, and we will have Stéphanie Lahoz-Toyer, Ian Cornell, and Stefano Verde. So, just a few words before we start. A few words to introduce the speaker of the first part. So, Ruben is policy officer at DG Climate Action at the European Commission since March 2018. where he is working on carbon markets, emissions trading, and the EU ETS development. Before he was at DG Energy and DG Competition at the Netherlands Competition Authority, and he has a Master of Laws from the University of Groningen. Daniele Villoresi is Senior Technical Expert for the Italian Ministry of Ecological Transition, has a PhD in Sustainable Development and International Cooperation, is the national contact point for the Innovation Fund, and is working on the definition within the Fit for 55 of the regulation establishing the CBAM. So that's why I say these people know what they're talking about. And in 2006, he designed and managed a life project entitled Vegetable Oil Initiative for a Cleaner Environment, and has been consultant for several public and private companies, including Municipality of Rome, Lazio Region, Italian Ministry of the Environment. And Valeria, you know her already. Just in case there was someone who was not present before, she's a full professor of economic policy at the Department of Economics, incoming head of department in a few hours, and among the founding members of our inter-university consortium SEEDS. She was at ENEA in the past. She has been participating or directing international research projects, particularly European Environmental Agency, and as coordinator of the research group assisting the European Commission DG Trade for the CG on impact assessment of trade and climate policy linkages. Before I start, I know this is a bit unexpected, you will probably forgive me, but since this is a conclusion of a 3 years project, I would like to say one word to DG Climate, to thank you for your participation, and also in memory of Mauro Petriccione. And if you don't mind, Mauro passed away a few weeks ago. He was a terrific contributor and terrific support. And if you don't mind, I would like to give a round of applause in memory of Mauro. Okay, before I get too emotional, I will pass immediately to Ruben. My idea would be to have Ruben's perspective on the Fit for 55 negotiations, ETS2, SCF, what's going on in the trialogue that is happening right now, and what we can expect for the future. I would suggest a first round of table of 5, 8, maximum 10 minutes, and then we will open up to the questions.
All right. Thanks a lot, and thank you very much for the kind words for my boss, much appreciated. And thank you very much also for the excellent work that you did, and together with Stefano, of course, under the live DChat program. Indeed, 5 to 8 minutes is short. The good thing is it's not so difficult as what you've been doing previously during this week. It's much simpler, I think, in terms of the content of the policy work. And I also understand that you already know a lot about climate policy, and so I don't have to introduce what an ETS is and how it works, cap and trade, etc. So we can dive, I think, straight into where we are today, which is that we are negotiating with the European Parliament and the Council the Fit for 55 package. So the Fit for 55 package is a package of legislation that the Commission adopted in 2021, in July, so just over a year ago. And it's a package that seeks to implement the policies that need to deliver the 55% target. So there is a political target, binding target, for European countries to together reduce their emissions by 55% by 2030, so already in 7.5 years' time. There is agreement on that, it's in the climate law, but now we need to make the policies that will actually deliver these emission reductions. And those policies, they are all in law, of course, in legislative acts. Many exist already and need to be revised, some are new, and all of them are in this big legislative package which makes these policies fit for 55, and that's where the name comes from. I will focus on 3 of those policies. I think there are 4 that are important to climate policy, that are most important to climate policy. Then there is also a lot on energy. There's also a lot on just transition and the social component. But I will focus on the ETS, the ETS directive, ETS 1 as we can call it now, the existing emissions trading system that applies to power, that applies to industry and aviation. Then ETS 2, a new system that will apply to buildings and road transport, if and when it is adopted. And the third is the Social Climate Fund. It's a separate regulation, it's not in the ETS directive, but it's closely linked to this new ETS 2. The 4th legal act that I think is of relevance today is the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, but Daniele will talk about that. So to start from the ETS 1, why are we revising it? Why are we making it fit for 55? Because the sectors need to contribute more than they do today to achieve the necessary emission reductions. So today we have a cap in the system. It's a cap and trade system. It will bring us down automatically to minus 43% compared to 2005. And our proposal is that they need to go down to minus 61%. So they need to do a lot more. They need to reduce their emissions a lot more. Now it's very simple to increase the ambition of an ETS. You just put the cap a little bit down and then the emissions go down. So we could have stopped there and just draw a new line, draw a new linear reduction factor of the annual amount of allowances, and that was that. But of course, if you reduce the cap, if you reduce the amount of allowances that go into the market, you also start impacting all kinds of other building blocks that are in the ETS directive upon which the ETS is built. I think the most important one is free allocation. You know that there's today free allocation in the ETS. That means that industries, they don't have to buy all their allowances on the market. They get a significant amount of allowances for free. And so they face only a portion of the carbon price. If we reduce the cap, reduce the available amount of allowances, we also reduce the available amount of free allowances that are available. And so we need to see how we can still protect European industries against carbon leakage so that they don't leave the EU, but not anymore with the same amount of free allowances. This is also where the CBAM comes in. Secondly, if you reduce the supply, but the demand stays the same, then the price goes up. The price of allowances goes up. And that is what we have seen happening already after the announcement of the political agreement on the 55%. Everybody immediately started calculating what does this mean for us as an industry being part of the ETS. We're going to have fewer free allowances. We're going to have fewer allowances overall around in the market. Let's buy. And so the price went up. And the price went up significantly in precisely that month of December 2020 when the political agreement on the 55% was reached. And so many people, and that's a bridge to the next topic, many people saying the price has gone up because the ETS is in the hands of speculators. We need to do something about financial entities being active in this market. Actually, there are good reasons why we know that the price has increased the way it has increased. So these topics, and there are more, but to save time, I will stick to that. I won't talk about the market stability reserve, etc. These topics are now being discussed also with the European Parliament and the European Council in these so-called trilogues. So these two institutions, they looked at the Commission's proposal of July 2021. They adopted their position in June 2022. For the Council, it's called the General Approach. For the Parliament, it's called a mandate, but they are the same type of documents. They're basically amending our legislation by striking through things they don't like and adding things in bold that they want to add. We put these now into a so-called 4-column document, and we take it to the trilogues, whereby we see Commission proposal, Parliament position, Council position, and then an agreement or comments. A 4th column is empty, and we're negotiating on that. Those are confidential, so we cannot say anything about. But it's clear from the amendments where the focus of these other two institutions is. On ETS 1, the focus is not so much on ambition. It's not so much on how much are we going to reduce our emissions. So that is good, especially in this time of energy crisis. Some people are saying, should we take it a bit easier with climate policy? Shouldn't we press pause for a second? let everybody recover from all these crises, and then we continue decarbonization. No, that's not happening. I think everybody is very much convinced that the climate targets are the right targets and that we should push ahead with the European Green Deal. So let's hope the situation stays like that in the months to come. Then maybe a few words on the other two legislative acts, so the ETS2 and the Social Climate Fund. ETS2 is a new system that will apply to buildings and road transport. So everybody who heats their house, not with electricity, but with a different fuel. Everybody who has a car, not like Simon, an electric car, but an old-fashioned internal combustion engine. Everybody will start facing a carbon price. Today there are many taxes already on your energy bill and also on the fuel, of course, excises. But this will be a new one on top. And so it's not necessarily a very popular measure at this time. A lot of the discussion is indeed about that. How much is this going to cost for consumers? At the same time, we think, and we are still defending that position from the Commission, that it is necessary that these two sectors start contributing significantly to reaching the 55% economy-wide target. So we know ETS is going to do 61%. They do more than they should, or more than average, let's say. These sectors have to do a bit less, but they are coming from much further away. There has been no European binding legislation for these sectors. They are big sectors in terms of emissions. They contribute 30% to the overall ETS emissions, and they have not been reducing their emissions at all. So emissions have been going up in the last few years from these sectors. So there are a lot of good policies in place. Usually they are national policies. It's also a national competence of member states under the effort sharing regulation to bring emissions down in these sectors, but they have not done so. And so if they come to us and say, we want to continue doing it nationally, we are a bit skeptical because we see from the past that it's not working. And so we want to put a carbon price on top of what they are doing today, not instead of. The other policies will still exist and they will continue to apply standards, but the carbon price should give an extra incentive for people to start insulating their houses and governments to start supporting that, electric driving, better public transport, etc. So that is the second part. And the third part, the Social Climate Fund, is very closely linked, and then I'll stop because I think I'm going over time. Closely linked to the ETS2, we are imposing a new tax. It's not a tax, it's a charge, but on top of bills of people. Nobody, by the way, has to start trading in allowances and buying allowances themselves. That would mean we would have 500 million Europeans active in the ETS. It applies upstream. It applies to the fuel suppliers and the electricity and the gas suppliers. They are the ones that have to surrender these allowances for the fuels that they sell. But they will pass on the costs to everybody. And so, and then pay it to their governments. And so this mechanism will raise a lot of revenues. And we have proposed that 25% of those revenues go into a European Social Climate Fund. That would be around 72 billion euros. And they should be spent on mitigating the impacts of this new system. Not only via direct income support, but also via financing investments, particularly in houses, to make sure that precisely the most vulnerable consumers are less exposed to the carbon price because they use less energy. And therefore they have a lower carbon price. So that is more or less where we stand. We're negotiating all these three topics. In October there will be the first political trilogues where really the politically difficult issues will be discussed. The hope is still to conclude this whole process for Fit for 55 before the COP27. I'm not sure how realistic it is, but let's say before the end of the year we should have a political agreement. Then it takes a bit of time to finalize the legal texts, but everybody already knows what's going to happen. And then in the course of 2023, the legislation will start applying. By the way, this new carbon price will apply only from 2026 for the transport and the buildings. In parallel, there is the whole energy crisis ongoing. We will come to it later. I think it also impacts, of course, even if people say, no, they are separate tracks, but it impacts the negotiations. It also impacts very directly the ETS, because there are some proposals in Repower EU, but also in the interventions in the electricity market that affect the ETS. But again, I think the focus is still very much on getting this Fit for 55 package through as quickly as possible, so that we still have a couple of years before it's 2030 and we need to have reached our target. Maybe I'll keep it at that for this stage.
Thank you, Ruben, for summarizing where we are staying in this negotiation process, which is obviously made more complex in these hard times, so to speak. It would be great, or it would have been great, to arrive at COP27 already with a common position for Europe to reinforce its negotiation power at the international level. But obviously, we also need to proceed cautiously given the situation right now. And one of the aspects that certainly requires some caution is the CBAM, especially looking into the future and the next few, well, what is in 1 or 2 months' time now, the COP27. And so I would like to know from Daniele, who's a real expert on this, his view on the topic.
Okay. Good morning to everyone. My views on this topic, I think in this moment is the CBAM negotiation is at the first stage, and so there is not many elements that is defined. First of all, I try to explain a little how the CBAM works. The CBAM is a mechanism that is a carbon border mechanism that enter in, how can I say, is parallel to the ETS, but the scope is not the industrial sector, but the scope of this mechanism are the import of goods. In particular, the risk of carbon leakage in the ETS is how can I say, is managed about with the free allocation. In the case of the CBAM, naturally with the free allocations and with the ETS, the EU producers have to face major expenditure for the production of their products with the application of the ETS, because they had to pay the emission certificates on the market. At the same time, the producers of third countries that didn't have any climate change policies and they didn't have to pay the price of ETS has to can have some can benefit from this situation, and so the CBAM wants to, we can say, to wants to equilibrate these differences, and wants to make can say make pay the embedded emissions in the imports when the goods enter into the customs authorities in the EU. In particular, so some products that are imported in the EU, that are the more carbon intensive products that are imported, when enter into the EU customs, has to pay for the embedded emissions, for the carbon embedded emissions. the carbon embedded emissions are evaluated following a methodology that is at this moment is only is not is linked to the ETS methodologies to evaluate. The difference is that naturally in this case we are speaking about goods, and so is embedded in the goods. For in the case of ETS, the evaluation of emission cap, and so the decarbonization instead is linked to the sector and so to the industry, and naturally this methodology has to naturally has to be combined in order to don't have mismatch among the two markets. In particular, the CBAM, as I said, is linked to the import, and so when it has to be compliant with the WTO regulations. This compliance with WTO regulations means that ETS and CBAM has to be applied proportionally in order really not to have problem with the WTO rules of the WTO rules. And so for the first 10 years, the mechanism will be applied gradually. Specifically for the first 10 years, every year the CBAM, the certification of CBAM certificates of embedded emission will be evaluated only for the 10%, and parallelly in the EATS, the sector that are involved in the CBAM will face the decrease of free allocation of the same percentage. So in the first time 10%, and every year this mechanism will continue, and at the end of 10 years, the sector will not have any free allocations, but there we applied all the price of all the quantity of embedded emission in the certification with the certificates of CBAM. In particular, this transitional period will start in 2025 and will end in 2035. For these 2 years, beginning from the 2023 to December 2025, there will be a period in which the mechanism will be, how can I say, will be fit, in particular with the monitoring of imports, quantity of goods imported, in order to try to develop the system in the right way. For we can take it that the aim of this legislation is that in the future all sectors will be covered by the CBAM. I say that it's possible that there will not be free allocation, and so all sectors will not have a free allocation, and they will contribute to the CBAM. Naturally, in this first period, the scope, and so the sector that will be involved in the CBAM mechanism was identified five goods: cement, iron, aluminium, the electricity, and so on, also the import of electricity, and fertilizers. These are we can say that these are the more important sectors for the impact on climate change in EU, and they cover something like 60 or 70% of the total amount of CO2 emission from the industry in EU. And the, how can I say, the amount of free allocation that will not be allocated to the sectors will be auctioned through the ETS auction system, and the revenues will be used to finance intervention, to finance carbon efficiency in the industry, in the European industry, in order also to help these sectors that will not have this free allocation. That this is naturally a problem for this sector that for this period will not have. How can I say, support for the carbon leakage problems. Naturally, as I say, is important due to the problem of WTO compliance. It will not be possible to have other measures because this is how can I say red lines that it will not be crossed in the future. And I told you before that the system in this moment is will cover only 5 goods, but the provision is that there will be the enlargement to other also to other goods. And in fact, in the regulation is provided every 2 years, there is the provision that there will be a revision of the regulation in order to enlarge the scope and also to solve problems that probably will start with the implementation of the system. I end this intervention only telling that there is some member states would like also to try to have some instruments that will work to support the exports, and in order to compensate the CBAM effects, because the CBAM effects will be applied on the imports, and on exports there will be some impacts. This is how I say that yes, the WTO compliance didn't at the moment didn't allow any changings, but this it will be possible that something will change with the discussions and with the revision of 2 years, with the periodical revision of the regulation.
Thank you, Daniele, for showing how the system goes, and yes, life will tell. I will I would say, exactly, to reply to your consideration. I would like now to move to Valeria, because Valeria has been working also with the models that we have seen in the summer school on the possible effects of the CBAM, and I think she has her own view. So then, Valeria.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this policy session, because I think that it is extremely relevant for academics to be involved also in this kind of discourse, not only for informing the models, but also for understanding how to implement them for helping the system and the policy-making process. So thanks a lot. And may I say that I'm not the perfect person speaking about the two policy issues here addressed. So I try to be as much as smooth as possible on that. Thank you.
Do your best.
Now, regarding the first point raised by Ruben related to the ETS2, I understand that it is really difficult to be implemented, especially for the 2 points, the acceptability of the policy, is it right? Because it could have really relevant social impacts. And maybe the explanation of the distinction between ETS 1 and 2 is exactly that, in a sense that ETS 2 was directed towards, even if they are a large number of firms, but they are really well indicated in the legislation. So we knew which were the agents involved, the stakeholders involved into the process. In the case of the transportation and building sector, we have a huge impact on a very diffused consumption process, so that the impact is less predictable maybe in terms of the social effect. And provided that the energy structures of the different countries belonging to the EU are really different across each other. So I think that the policy discourse now is how to design a flexible enough implementation mechanism to help the different countries in somehow regulating the ETS internally in terms of, for example, the design of the social climate fund that should be diversified in the different forms of policies to be implemented according to the different characteristics. So maybe something should be done more intensive in the sense of analyzing the distributional impacts of the policies at the national level in order to design how the social climate fund should work within each country. So maybe this could be a suggestion for the policy-making process also to reinforce such kind of analysis. I have a question to Ruben related to these putting these, let me say, carbon price on top of the existing energy price, for example, for the transportation sector. The question is, it has been at least 10 years that in the European Union we are debating about the energy tax reform, which I think is highly correlated with this new system. In a sense, I know the Italian experience, but I know that in other countries, for example, France is quite the same. We have that the energy taxation currently available on the, in the legislation rules, is a general form of taxation, in a sense that the energy taxation is imposed at the consumption level, and then the revenues coming from the energy taxation are collected generally in the fiscal budget, in the public budget of the government, and then used for whatever activity, not directly related to, for example, supporting renewable energies. This is not uniformly applied in all Europe. There are countries with an energy taxation rule which already provide the function of the revenues. So maybe together with putting a price, an additional carbon price to the final market price perceived by the consumers, maybe also something more on the real application of the revenues coming from the general energy taxation could help the system to transform and to switch from a fossil-based transportation sector to a renewable-based. So maybe a combination, policy mix again, a combination of different elements could help also reducing the cost, because the expected impact, we are working on that for Italy, and the expected impact, for example, for a carbon price equal to 60 euros per ton of dollars will have in the next 3 years a negative, a regressive impact in terms of income distribution. So this form of complementary policies should be transformed into the core of the climate policy instruments. And with respect to the CBAM, I have several concerns related to the application of this mechanism from both a theoretical point of view and also a practical point of view. I start from the last point related to the compatible set of rules with respect to WTO compliance. And the problem is that at the moment, the current computation method for the carbon intensity is the only feasible with respect to the multinational favorite nation rule in WTO. Meaning that if I have to tax or to put a tariff, okay, the adjustment mechanism is taxing something coming from abroad, so taxing imports. If I put a tax and it is computed on the basis of the carbon intensity of the imported goods, if you are imposing differentiated carbon intensities according to the different country from where the import is coming, the import flow is coming, you are automatically not respecting the multilateral, the most favored nation, or the multilateral agreement, meaning that provided that the carbon price is the same, the ad valorem is the same, the carbon price applied, so the tariff applied in nominal term is the same, but multiplied by a different carbon intensity coefficient means that the ad valorem equivalent on the final price is different. And in that case, you are applying a different percentage to the same good imported by different countries. And this is absolutely not acceptable from the WTO point of view. So the common carbon intensity related to the specific good is a requirement, at least at the moment. But I have another, according to the latest computation, this carbon intensity is applied with respect to the ETS approach, right? So we are applying a best available technology approach, meaning that we are not capturing the real carbon intensity of the imported goods. So the amount of CO2 emissions that are the amount included in the tariff is lower with respect to the effective, to the real carbon embodied in the final good. The second point is the real effect in correcting what we are discussing about, the carbon leakage. And the problem is that, how many emissions are embedded in the goods exported towards Europe with respect to the overall carbon emissions embedded in the overall traded goods? This is the question. Because you have, when you talk about carbon intensity, my first issue is, are we talking about the latest stage of the production process, or are we applying a system of calculation of embedded carbon along the whole supply chain? This is the first question. And the second one is, even if we are taking into account the whole supply chain in calculating the embedded emissions, the answer is if the European Union will put a carbon tariff or an adjustment mechanism applied to the imports, can we expect that, for example, that imports that were previously directed to the European Union will be directed towards another country? Let's say China exporting to the European Union, decide to export to India or to the US, provided that they don't apply an adjustment mechanism at that border. So in terms of changing the carbon leakage effect, maybe this is not the best way to solve the problem. If, on the other side, we are imposing an adjustment mechanism to protect the European Union firms, in that case, it is more acceptable from a political point of view. But the problem is, and this is my last point, I don't want to take other minutes to the discussion. We were discussing with Ruben yesterday about the model that we use in DigiTrade for calculating the impacts of the CBAM. There are problems in moduling the CBAM approach, but our first results are that by imposing a CBAM with the current carbon intensity calculation, so according to a best available technology methodology, so the carbon intensity of the European Union firms, the GDP of the European Union will be decreased by applying the CBAM and not increased. Why? Because there will be an impact in terms of an increased price, the transition from the carbon price on the final price of the imported goods, so that we are paying more the iron and steel produced at home, and we are also paying more the iron and steel produced by China, for example. And provided that these energy-intensive production goods are also inputs, intermediate inputs for our industrial sectors, let's say, for example, the automotive sector, the final result could be an increase in the generalized prices paid for both national, domestic produced and externally produced goods. So the final output could be a negative effect instead of a positive one. Maybe some caution in designing this policy should be taken into account. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Vale. I think we can have a few minutes for a reply from Ruben, from Daniele, and before we move to the...
Yes.
Because you asked...
I move. Before I move.
And you move. Because you asked the questions, so already...
Yes. It's my fault.
I think it's a very good question you asked about public acceptability related to taxation, to new taxation. In this case, it would be an emissions trading system, it would not be a tax. That's an important distinction legally, because in the EU, for a tax, you need unanimity. So everybody needs to agree around the table. That's why we never have European taxes. An ETS, an emissions trading system, is a regulatory measure, an environmental measure, and then you can decide with qualified majority voting in the council. Nevertheless, of course, it looks a lot like a tax. Everybody's going to pay it. And I think that in order to achieve this public acceptability, how you use the revenues is indeed crucial. And we know from the existing ETS that there are some member states who indeed say, we don't earmark these ETS revenues, we put them directly into our general budget, and then we spend the budget as we want to spend our budget. It shouldn't matter where the money comes from when we decide where we spend it on. Now, I think budgetarily it's a good principle, except that in the case of emissions trading systems, it's extra important that you maintain public acceptability, because such a system and the carbon price signal that it sends very much depends on the trust of the market that the measure will continue to exist and that the government is serious about it. And so if people dislike the system a lot, they may vote in a government that then gets rid of the system, and that is what we do not want to happen, of course. And so we are trying very much, and we have proposed it now in the revision I was talking about before, to get member states to earmark the ETS revenues, to say, now it says member states should spend 50% of the revenues from the ETS on climate purposes. And now we have proposed that it says member states shall spend 100% of the auction revenues on climate and energy purposes. The council then deleted the shall and put back in the should. The parliament kept the shall, kept the 100%, and put a whole new chapter on visibility requirements, which personally I like. So they say member states, when they spend ETS revenues on a certain project, they should also make it visible on social media with big signs. This project was financed from the ETS. When member states spend their revenues on a climate dividend, like Austria is doing now for its national ETS too, they should make it very clear, sending to people the dividend, the money, directly on their bills, and make it clear this is, you get this money because our country is participating in an emissions trading system. And I think that way you get much more public acceptability. I don't know if we will achieve it. For the new ETS, of course, a lot goes to the social climate fund, and we want also that money to be invested in precisely the right projects to bring down the exposure of especially the vulnerable people to the carbon price. Let's hope that the social climate fund will maintain a good meaningful size. A good news is that the rich people, relatively richer people, they have more emissions, and so they pay more. They also therefore contribute more to the social climate fund, but they don't profit from the social climate fund as much because we want it to be targeted to the vulnerable. So indeed, it's a regressive tax, but with policy, you can make it into a progressive policy, and I think that's the objective of this measure. No. I also have some comments on the CBAM, but maybe I'll let Daniel go first.
Okay, I think that is my position is very hard because how can I say, your question, I think that is the question, because naturally there were some there was study assessment on the impacts of the CBAM, and in particular, we as member state studied the documents. Member state asked also for more clarification on these documents, but naturally how can I say, the mechanism was defined in this way, and in the phase of negotiation, I don't know how in the phase of negotiation with the European Parliament, what will be the definition of the mechanism. How can I say? I can say that what I told you before is something that could be applied, but in this moment, for example, when you speak about the embedded emission of the methodologies, all these elements will be naturally defined and deepened with can I say, with the delegates, with delegated acts, and so and that was very technical, and we know that there are methodologies that consider all the how can I say, all the aspects. Is at this stage is the only I can say that at this stage the regulation the regulations say that only direct emission for the first time will be considered as embedded emission, but with the Commission and also supported by the European Parliament, it's possible that also indirect emission will be considered in the evaluation. But how I told you before, in this moment, these elements will it's not so defined, and so I repeat, is difficult to have in this moment the complete, we can say, the complete state of the art of what will be the CBAM.
I look at you just to know if you want to, but you have to go, so it's Stefano, do you mind if we go on with the second part, because otherwise you will not have enough time in the second part. And then maybe if there is some time left, we can intervene also from the rest. So thanks for the moment. I would suggest that we move to part 2 and open up the view from the European context to the international context. Well, actually with the CBAM we already did, but somehow even more explicitly so, and look at the international perspectives on carbon pricing. So here, as I said, we have Stéphanie Lahaut-Steuer, Stefano Verde, and Ian Cornelia. Stéphanie is a climate expert with a long experience on carbon pricing. She's senior advisor at Adelphi, which is a think tank, public policy consultancy on climate and environment development, a member of the Secretariat of the International Carbon Action Partnership, and has worked extensively on these topics, also for the UN Climate Change Secretariat, and private sector in many projects. Stefano is assistant professor at the University of Siena. He was my deputy director for a long time, basically moved very recently to the University of Siena. He has been adjunct professor at the Lewis. He has a BA from Roma Tor Vergata, master and PhD from the Trinity College Dublin, and again has worked extensively on emission trading system, climate change, redistribution policies. And Ian is a research associate from the School of Transnational Governance at UI. He has trained experience in London and Oxford, has worked 2 years at Oxira, and now has a strategy and policy team at 3E, a Brussels-based renewable energy technology company. So long experience in the private sector, in climate policy, energy markets, and sustainable finance. So my question to the three of you obviously concerns the international aspects. In particular, starting with Stéphanie, you made some very interesting research on the connections between ETS and removal units. I think that would be of great interest to our students as well, beyond me in person.
Okay. So what I want to do today is I'll just give a very brief introduction to what we have in terms of emission trading systems around the world, and I'll give you a small taster on this project on ETS and removals that we did, as well as on the upcoming project that I'm working on ETS and carbon capture and storage and carbon capture and use. And I will not go into much detail, but to the extent that this is interesting, we can explore it in the Q&A. Right. So who is the International Carbon Action Partnership? We are basically a small intergovernmental organization. We cover 40 jurisdictions around the world that either have or are developing emission trading systems. The idea is to share best practice between those jurisdictions, build partnerships, facilitate alignment and linking between those systems, and explore the role of emission trading systems in climate policy. And we do that through 3 pillars. We do research, this is the technical dialogue. We do a lot of capacity building to policymakers, private sector, NGOs around the world on what is an ETS and how do you do it well. And we also produce a lot of knowledge products, a handbook on how to design and implement an ETS, a yearly status report where we describe every single ETS out there and how they are running. Right, so that's about us. Right, and let's go into which emission trading systems we have out there and which ones are in force. So we have 25 systems in force, those are the blue ones. We have 7 that are under development. Under development means that legislation has been adopted and it has mandated that an ETS be put in place, but the ETS is not yet operational. And we have 15 that are under consideration. One of them, my home country, Brazil, as much of a disappointment it has been, that political process. We also have countries that have 2 emission trading systems in place, such as Germany, that is subject to the EU ETS, and also has a national emission trading system that covers transport and buildings, and is also one of the big advocates for an ETS2 in Europe. One of the really big kind of new kids in the block has been China. They started an emission trading system in 2021, and before that, they had 7 or 8, depending how you count, emission trading system pilots that had been operating for many years. These emission trading systems have a lot of commonalities, but also a lot of differences. One of the big commonalities relates to the fact that the vast majority of them cover industrial and power emissions. So these are the 2 blue circles that you see in the middle. A few of them cover transport and buildings, so those are the green little boxes, and the vast majority of them are covered upstream. So that means that instead of, as Ruben was saying, instead of including in the system each individual citizen that burns fuel in its car, you would cover the fuel distributor or importer, and so you cover that upstream. Fewer still cover domestic aviation and waste. Only New Zealand covers forestry, and New Zealand is also the country that is looking into covering agriculture in its system. And it's very, very difficult to do so, but very important to New Zealand because the New Zealand ETS covers 49% of New Zealand emissions, and I think almost the remaining 50% is agriculture. And this is quite relevant for many of the developing countries that are thinking about emission trading systems and that have pretty big emissions from land use change, and forestry sectors. Right. One very interesting thing that we've seen recently, and I'll start with this bottom graph. This is the price between 2008 and 2021 for the various systems. And for a very long time, so back when I started working in this, it was 2005, prices went up and up and up. And then we used to think that, you know, the big decarbonization drive is coming and we're going to change the planet. And then the 2008-2009 financial crisis hit, and industrial production went down a lot in Europe, and that depressed prices a lot. And we stayed, especially in the EU ETS, with pretty low prices for a very long time. And as Ruben was saying, with the MSR and very strong political commitments of not only Europe, but many jurisdictions around the world, we have seen prices increase quite dramatically over the last few years, to the point where the EU ETS surpassed 100 euros per ton, going from below 10 for a very long time. This story, however, has, you know, its wrinkles because it's 2022 and we have the energy crisis. But one thing that I would note is that the price increase has actually been quite resilient even during COVID. And it has been just very interesting to see how mature the systems have been and how resilient they have been to even the COVID shock. If we look at this part of the graph, you can see that some systems did suffer disturbances in their price, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it is not dramatic, right? And it's roughly still at the same level. Right. Why don't the arrows work? Right. So here's some very personal thoughts on where we are with emission trading systems, and I apologize for having a lot of text. It would have been better to have some animations. So the first one is that emission trading systems and compliance instruments more generally, so here we're talking about carbon taxes, tradable performance standards, are increasingly being developed, also in developing countries. And this is very nice. This means that developing countries around the world do take their climate targets seriously, and they are looking into instruments to actually achieve them. It has been amazing to see what an effect the EU CBAM has had. I work a lot with developing countries, and once the CBAM was announced, suddenly everybody started talking about carbon pricing. It is amazing. And I was like, yes, go Europe. There has also been a lot of discussion on carbon clubs, so basically how do we, whenever you start talking about putting a price on carbon, people start saying, hey, but if I put a price on carbon and my neighbor doesn't put a price on carbon, we have a problem, and then we start talking about carbon clubs, right? So aligning expectations, aligning ambition, aligning carbon prices, especially with it across trade partners within regions, and there has been a lot of movement on this as well. The topic of carbon clubs has been around since the dawn of times, and it always comes back, and this is one of the moments when it's being discussed again. It was taken up in the G20, G7 under Germany, and perhaps some more will come of it, but really the main driver has been the EU CBAM and the fact that, industries around the world are going to have to put money on the table, and that is leading to good policy decisions, I think. Prices are also starting to bite, which is great. So for the first time in a very long time, we see boards of directors discussing the exposure of their companies to the carbon price. And this is really a first, and it's a very welcome development. Systems are maturing, and as I mentioned before, they're becoming more resilient to shocks, COVID, the energy crisis now. But challenges are massive, and there's still a lot of reluctance, and there's also a lot of confusion on the role and the potential use of voluntary carbon markets. So where should countries rely on voluntary action? Where should countries impose compliance obligations? Can there be a transition pathway between the two? And how do we involve companies and private individuals in decarbonization beyond compliance obligations? I think there's also, at least for me personally, and that's why I emphasize that these are personal thoughts, there's just a lot of realpolitik when it comes to climate finance and deep decarbonization and transformational change, in that the reactions to the energy crisis and to COVID as well just show that the finance can come together, right? Like Germany put together a relief package of 65 billion euros for this year. Developed economies were supposed to put together 100 billions per year for climate finance. We're nowhere near that. But this is, in a way, sadly, a flaw of democracies, because it is very difficult in democracies to make decisions on very large sums of money, but it is possible. And I think one of my favorite phrases in the whole energy crisis has been framing renewable energy as freedom energy. And I wish we could expand that to decarbonization more broadly, not only inside of Europe, but globally. And looking ahead, this is where the research on removals comes in. I've been looking into the outlook towards deep decarbonization, and this is where we start talking about, okay, we have an ETS, and we're increasing our linear reduction factor, and this linear reduction factor is such that the cap will go from being positive, and at some point it reaches a zero line. And what happens then, right? What does it mean to have a cap that approaches zero? And will it stay positive? Will it go to zero? Will it go to negative? And what does that mean? And so this is why I led a research on ETSs and removals. And here, removals, we're talking about technologies that suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. They can be natural-based, or they can be technological-based. And we looked into what role ETSs could play in incentivizing these removal technologies, what role these removal technologies could play in the ETS itself, and what are the risks and opportunities of different forms of interaction. I can go into that if you want, but I encourage everyone to download the paper on this link. And I'm also right now working on carbon capture and storage. So here we're talking about preventing CO2 from getting into the atmosphere in the first place. So this is mainly where fossil fuels are burned or process emissions are generated. We prevent the CO2 to go into the atmosphere. Here we talk about industrial point source capture, but also bioenergy and CCS and direct air capture and CCS, which are technologies that suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. And all of these hopefully put things safely underground. So we're looking into how ETSs currently incorporate CCS provisions. If ETSs wish to incorporate them, what elements need to be addressed, and what role could ETSs play in incentivizing CCS, and are there disadvantages to doing so? Watch this space. It should be published this year. It has been a bit challenging. Here is just an outline of some of the things that ICAP produces, and I encourage everyone to go onto our webpage. It's a really nice set of products to explain how ETSs work and how they can work best. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephanie. Actually, yes, I also encourage our students to take a look at the ICAP webpage, which is really fantastic in terms of information it gives. And also, we look forward to the publications. We'll read your publication and look forward to the next ones. But I will look forward also to Jan, who is really entering in the topic, if you want, because she gave an assist talking about the voluntary carbon markets. And so I would like to know more about it through your experience.
Thank you very much, and real pleasure to be here. And also, I think indeed, with what Stephanie said, that there's a lot of confusion about voluntary carbon markets. I will try to give some clarity on where we are. So I'm a research associate here at the School of Transnational Governance, and I'm in the team of the EIB Climate Chairholder, who is Jos Delbeke, who's the former DG Klima, and the architect of the emissions trading system. And we are looking very much now, obviously that has been very exciting to create a market that did not exist before. And actually, we're now looking with this same lens to the voluntary carbon market, organizing a market which was not really functioning before. There were already vestiges of that market. But so I will start with just saying, why? Why would we have a voluntary carbon market? I mean, these are carbon credits which signify a ton of CO2 either removed from the atmosphere or mitigated somewhere, reduced beyond a benchmark of what would already have been happening. And so some question that we should pay any attention to voluntary carbon markets, because only compliance markets are, like the ETS, are relevant for policy. Now, I would say there's three reasons why voluntary carbon markets are still interesting. One is that corporate net zero commitments, and we've seen a lot of them in the past years, big corporations saying we are going net zero, and thereby they are going beyond what is legally required from them. There's no legal obligation for a corporate to go net zero, and if they want to, they will probably rely partly on carbon credits. Secondly, not every country is moving towards a compliance trading system, and we've seen the map. One notable absent is the United States. There's some states of the United States, like California and on the East Coast, who are setting up or have set up compliance markets, but in general, the US is not moving to a carbon trading system, and a lot of US corporations want to tap into this carbon market because it does put a price on carbon, which and this price of carbon is integrated into the decision making. And thirdly, not every sector is within the ETS. We've talked about ETS2, transport and housing, but especially removals negative emissions, sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere, as Stephanie has called it, those are not covered yet, and yet there's a lot of development in projects that nature-based or technology-based that are doing just that. And putting a price on that is actually giving them an incentive to try and continue this work, because in the end, to be really net zero, we will need negative emissions. So that's shortly why. Now, the problem of that market, because it's a voluntary market, is it lacks market institutions that have a guarantee on quality and demand that can have this market functioning. And we've seen that the early phases of voluntary carbon markets always led to very low prices, because you could just not trust that at the end there was really a ton of carbon staying out of the atmosphere. And so a market is a supply side and a demand side, and what we are seeing right now is that on the supply side and on the demand side, very important initiatives are being taken to clean up this market and establish a real functioning market, though voluntary, but still with a price which really signifies a price on the carbon reduced. And on the supply side, there's the very important evolution and work of the Integrity Council of the Voluntary Carbon Markets. It's in itself a voluntary initiative, but it aims to set up the global voluntary carbon market. It's very ambitious, and it works under the slogan, "Build integrity and scale will follow." And I think I like the slogan, because I think it's indeed in that order that one needs to work. We need to first build integrity, because if we cannot believe in that price signal, in the end you will not have meaningful effects for the climate from that market. So you want to build integrity, and then scale will follow. Now, they have put out for consultation, which is still going on right now, so if anyone wants to react, it's still the time, core carbon principles on what are these credits, what are the requirements to these credits. They need to be additional to what would have happened without this price incentive. Obviously want to avoid double counting. You want it to be permanent. If you say, I'm storing CO2 in sort of wetland somewhere in Nigeria, you want to be sure that the CO2 stays there, and that in 10 years' time, because of some developments, this CO2 is released again. So permanence is an issue. Governance, obviously, an issue. Registration of trades, where will this happen? You need a register of all the trades happening, so that you can follow a carbon credit through, when it passes from the one hand to the other. You need MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification standards, and you would want to embed it in the broader sustainability development goals with respect to indigenous populations and local communities, because a lot of these nature-based credits are actually in areas which, like rainforest or wetlands or mangrove, where there are communities living. And so you would want it to be with respect to those communities. So these are core carbon principles which are put out there to reflect on and to implement in a number of standards for the markets that sellers of credits would need to adhere to. There's also some attributes on the types, whether it's technology or nature-based, whether it's compliant with the Paris Agreement or not, and so forth. Those are elements are all there to basically create the market and clean up the supply side of that market. Now, on the demand side, which is also a question, because you are a corporate, you are saying Nestlé, and you say, I'm going to buy credits, so my shampoo that I'm, it's more Procter & Gamble, sorry for that, I'm in the same situation. Yeah, your product, okay, Nestle, I say your milk that you're putting out is, you want to make it carbon neutral, and so basically you want to offset any emission from the process with carbon credits. How do you report on that? Because we've seen recently, I think it was Shell, or it was BP, I have forgotten, but they put out an ad saying the first carbon neutral petrol was on the market. And and everyone was saying like carbon neutral petrol, how do you do that? And basically they just bought credits to offset the emissions of that, and they say, well, you know, now you can use the petrol, without any guilt or climate consideration because we've offset it. And that obviously, you know, many people thought that was actually, even from an advertising point of view, a bit fraudulent because it's misleading. Now, more seriously, because it's not only an advertising exercise, obviously legally you would want to have corporates being honest and transparent about the use of their credits, so that if they claim that some of their products are carbon neutral using offsets, you would need to be able to verify that. And there, the European Union is moving ahead with the first comprehensive set of legally binding ESG rules, the first in the world. And it's, I think it's underestimated also in the rest of the world when I talk to Americans and others about this. It's underestimated the work that the EU is doing here based on the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations. Those are two regulations that are out there. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive is still in discussion. Parliament has given a mandate. The general approach of the Council is still to be done, so the trilogue will follow. So this is not decided yet even. But what is very exciting there is that for the first time, I saw a draft standard on how to use a voluntary carbon credit. I mean, it had never existed before in EU legislation. It's still in draft, but it's there. And it addresses exactly the question of, well, you are a corporate, you are using this credit, well, which verification standard have you used? Is it an EU credit or an international one? Is it Article 6 Paris Agreement compatible or not? And so you have now on the table this possibility of regulating this on the demand side by creating disclosure obligations and transparency about how these credits are used. And I think the two pieces together, supply side and demand side, and the transparency and integrity standards it could bring, could lead to a more functioning market. Very interestingly is that the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, which is only applicable to financial market participants like fund managers, there the use of credits has not been elaborated yet, and it's actually an inconsistency between the two regulations. So you would expect also there that standards will need to follow, because for the same reason, if you are, as a financial consumer, you're buying shares in a fund and you're buying shares which are qualified on their degree of sustainability, you will want to know which part is credits. Are these credits from an integer source, are they verified or not? Otherwise, you're buying green, green shares or a green fund, and you're not sure that in the end it's actually sustainable what is behind there. So it's a question of, transparency. I will conclude here. What's next? I think these are all very new regulations, and it will take years before we get a real grip on these things. So imagine, and I think we should hope that on the supply side, these principles and the assessment framework becomes a standard somewhere in 2023, 2024. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive will, in all likelihood, land probably not even this year, so in 2023, will enter into force 2024 at the earliest. So it means that the first cycle of annual reporting on this will be 2024, 2025, leading up to 2026. Then the supervisory authorities, financial regulators, or the auditing world will have a look at this. You probably will need to issue new standards, or at least learn from the experiences of this first reporting round, and then it will enter probably in a more mature voluntary carbon market. So we're looking towards the end of this decade before this whole market is really, I think, has been tested and tried based on the new regulations that are being developed now. And I think that's an exciting prospect to look for. And there, just as an outro, I think it also means that on the basis of that integrity, and hopefully when this all works and on the demand side and the supply side, you have that integrity, I think we could start considering post-2030 to open the EU ETS for use of removal credits, which obviously it was tried once, it was stopped because basically there was a flood of low quality credits into the market, and then they said, no, we don't want this anymore, let's stop this. So will we try again? Perhaps, but I think we'll need at least a serious probationary period before trying this again on the basis of these new regulations. I'll stop there.
So again, life will tell, and we will look into the next decade with much interest. But as you said, build integrity first. I think that's what we need to do. We talk about voluntary carbon markets also in the Life Teacher project, and I would like to invite Stefano not to talk about that now because we don't have time, but about some of the main conclusions that we put forward in our project, in the last report of our project.
Before the conclusions, if I can make a few remarks first. The very first one about the CBAM, we heard before that it could be, Valeria said it could be vulnerable to the most favored nation principle of WTO. I think this is not really a question. I mean, it can be made compatible with the principles of the WTO. The question there, which is more for trade law specialists to address, but it's proving that the CBAM is basically an environmental instrument, and there are exceptions in WTO rules that can be claimed to make the CBAM compatible with the WTO rules. So I felt that this was important to say, otherwise the CBAM would not be meaningful. Also I would like to start my intervention by making a few points that maybe could be of interest to PhD students. The first point is more maybe can be considered more academic, theoretical, and it relates to a debate that in the academia has gone, as we have seen for several years, about within carbon pricing comparing carbon taxes and ETSs, and I think that so valuing the pros and cons of each. And I think that after several years of experience with these instruments, well, the first one is my impression that emissions trading is coming up as the most suited type of instrument for addressing the climate problem, addressing the climate mitigation problem. And compared to carbon taxes, you see emissions trading systems that are more used overall in the world. Notable examples are, of course, the EU and China. And on this, I think that it was enlightening a meeting that we had with a Chinese professor that we hosted here a few years ago, and he was involved in the setting up of the Chinese carbon market. And when we asked him, well, why did you go for the emission trading system rather than a carbon tax in China? He said, because the ETS gives you more certainty about the environmental outcome than a carbon tax. And so this is often forgotten, I think, in the debate between, well, is the carbon tax better than an ETS or not? So the environmental outcome, even though we know that the Chinese ETS does not have a fixed cap, not yet, at least, but it gives more certainty, I think, about the environmental effectiveness. And on these also, I think that if you look at the experience of the EU ETS, The EU ETS has showed certainly resilience. It's been in place since 2005, and as Stephanie said, at some point it went through the years of the financial and economic crisis. It's been going through the COVID-induced crisis, economic crisis, and it's still there. So it's proving to be the resilience. I think it's a characteristic of these instruments that it's really should be taken into appreciated, and precisely for these reasons, we see today that the EU ETS, yes, is being sometimes under attack of some business representatives or politicians. They would like, certainly in Italy, we have heard of, certain proposals of suspending the ETS. But actually, I think that the strength of an instrument of this kind is precisely that it's there and to stay. It's there to stay. And even if today we have, because of the energy crisis, for security reasons, we have like in Italy, for instance, coal power stations that have been reactivated. So emissions have been going up, are going up. But to me, to us, the fact that the ETS is there, that the cap is there over the long term, should be really appreciated as a guarantee that that the environmental outcome over the long term is still respected. So this really, all these considerations are about the comparison between carbon tax and emissions trading. Now, coming to a question that I think I was asked today to talk about is, international. What was it? International coordination? Basically, international cooperation on carbon pricing. Well, the way you would do it if you have ETS instruments, it would be through linking, and this is precisely linkages are the core of our project, the Live Digit project. And the first observation there is that certainly from a social planner perspective, okay, linking makes a lot of sense, economic sense, because it allows you to attain efficiency gains from trade. So basically, achieving the overall environmental objective at a lower cost. Then there are benefits in terms of a more liquid market, a less volatile market once you connect these markets through linking. But this is true from a social planner perspective. But in order to make linkages happen, it takes it takes two to tango. It's always the saying that comes to my mind. Basically, the linkage needs to be perceived as beneficial for all the parts, for all the jurisdictions that are involved. And that's not to take for granted. Let's take, for instance, the case of an hypothetical case, of course, of a linkage between the EU ETS and the Chinese ETS. The first consequence of a linkage would be that there would be a convergence of the prices in the two ETSs, and this, if the linkage was full, so a full type of linkage, there would be a perfect convergence. So there would be a major price impact, a major impact on the carbon prices of the two ETSs, and this can be, this can be problematic in the sense that, first of all, one should consider the general equilibrium effects of this price adjustment. So when you analyze the effects of a linkage between two or more ETSs, you should really go beyond the partial equilibrium representation of this thing and take into consideration all the general equilibrium effects, so the impacts on the whole economy. Because again, if you take that example, that type of linkage, the carbon price in China would go up. Well, what would that happen? What would be the consequences for trade, for Chinese trade? And so these should be taken into consideration in the analysis. I think that for PhD students, this is an important indication, methodological indication. Also, there are other aspects that certainly play a role in linkage decisions, like when you link, precisely because of this price adjustment, there will be wealth flows, wealth transfers between the jurisdictions. So it would happen in that example that basically the EU would buy some allowances, emission allowances from the Chinese ETS, and some emissions abatement would take place in China rather than in Europe. Now, this could be not particularly likable to everyone in Europe, in this case especially. There are distributional effects depending on within each ETS, depending on who is holding the allowances. Given that a carbon price change would impact on the value of those allowances and so on. So these are all elements to take into in consideration and explain why the linkage decisions are complex, and also therefore why we have seen so few linkages between ETSs so far. Part of our one of the objectives of our project was also to come up with, after basically analyzing all these aspects, coming up with suggestions for facilitating the establishment of linkages. And basically, I think that the last report should be online soon because it was finalized recently, and so you will find it. I invite you to go on the project's website and download it. So basically, what the idea we came up with was to basically to facilitate linkages through the establishment of price collars between the ETSs that intend to link to each other. And the rationale is to basically to eliminate the risk that comes with linking, at least with full linking, the risk that that price, which after linking is co-determined by the linked ETSs, basically goes too far off for the preferences of the ETSs that link to each other. So basically, constraining the post-link price would be a way of reducing the risk that is implicit in a linkage, at least and certainly in a full type of linkage. Okay. Now, of course, this implies that a jurisdiction is first of all, that we have an example of this kind, which is particularly interesting, which is the linkage between the California's ETS and the Quebec ETS. That effectively works precisely in this way. At some point, they decided to link, and they have a common or de facto common floor and ceiling. Doing this kind of thing implies that the parts involved are happy to have these limits on the carbon price, so a floor and a ceiling. That's not always the case. We know that, for instance, in our ETS, the European ETS, there's not such a thing. We have a mechanism that is alternative to a floor, which is the market stability reserve. And so this should be, first of all, we acknowledge that. I mean, our proposal is, well, this is one of the ways to facilitate linkages, then the specific conditions that are there, that depends, change from case to case. Does that mean that for Europe, these proposals completely irrelevant? I think that it depends. It depends on the level of priority on the degree of priority that is given to, that is assigned to international cooperation and harmonization of carbon prices. So basically, if Europe later in time will evaluate that it is really important to have homogeneous prices across as many emissions as possible, as much emissions as possible in the world, then this could become a sufficiently important reason for adjusting or adapting its own mechanism to make this happen. Again, this does not have to happen, but it could if the question of carbon price harmonization becomes sufficiently important. It also becomes in the interest of Europe as basically the liquidity of the market becomes shorter and shorter, given that we are going to have fewer and fewer allowances in the market as the cap goes down. So there could be an incentive there to link to other systems. Yes, just a final remark that this is again not the only possible way of trying and facilitating international harmonization of carbon prices. One could be, and we have heard about it recently, of basically more simply agreeing on a carbon price floor. And we have heard about it in the context of the G7, for instance. And that would be a simpler approach, technically, in that it does not require that all the parts have an ETS in place, and also there's not a ceiling involved there. It's a minimum carbon price, and then each jurisdiction would operate above that. So this is an alternative. Okay, but if you're talking about the ETSs, which was our focus in the project, collars would be an option.
Thank you, Stefano, for sharing your ideas and also our proposal. And let me say that I think this is a perfect conclusion for our Life Digit project, because it's a project that looks into the future somehow, coming with some proposal, right or wrong, but we try to give our contribution. And there is no better place to conclude it with you, with young, promising scholars that will be the future of environmental economics and of the profession. So I really look forward to more in terms of summer schools. Certainly it would be great to have you around in the future again. So, and also please keep looking at our webpage for other events and proposals that might come from FSR Climate and UI more in general. And I started saying life will tell, life told, and life goes on. So the project concludes, and will conclude administratively at the end of December, but let's say it concludes in terms of events now. But we are already, let's say, on a new path. And so take a look at our webpage, because life will go on with something else. I don't want to say now, but you will soon discover it. So thanks again to all of you. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our panelists, and see you soon. Thank you.
With a contribution from the LIFE program of the European Union.